Hey guys, before we get started, I want to quickly acknowledge the ongoing Screen Actors Guild strike, as we are obviously going to be talking about the film industry, and actors are a huge part of that. Now, when we started producing this video, we honestly didn't know where the Hollywood strikes would shake out by the time it aired, and while the Writers Guild has thankfully reached an agreement with the studios and their strike is over, the SAG-AFTRA strike is very much still ongoing, so we wanted to be very careful in the production of this video to not break any of the rules around promoting upcoming projects or doing anything that would undermine the strike. But as we also support few things here at TFD more than labor movements, we also wanted to acknowledge the strike and link you guys down in the description to an LA Times article that explains where SAG-AFTRA currently stands as of October 24th, so you can inform yourselves and help support this important movement. We hope that very soon they will have also reached an agreement that they are happy with, but for the time being, the strike goes on.
Cheers, everyone, and welcome to our very first video essay here at The Financial Diet. You might guess from the title, the thumbnail, the fact that I am eating some popcorn and drinking what appears to be a Cosmopolitan, but is in fact some fruit punch soda that I put in a martini glass because I'm not trying to get lit. I have like 10 pages of notes to get through. That today we are going to be talking about the rom-com. And to our members who are watching the extended director's cut with no ads, keep slaying. To those who are not yet members, what's wrong with you? All right, bottoms up, everyone. It's very artificial tasting. And I'm happy to announce that in addition to being in my video essay era, I'm also personally in my rom-com era. Now, what does that mean, you might be asking? Well, I'm working a high-powered glossy job at a prestigious magazine or for some reason an architectural firm, which I never have to show up for or am ever shown actually working on. And my treatment at this job is almost universally abusive, and this is usually portrayed somewhere on the scale from very bad to actually kind of feminist. I'm constantly consuming alcohol and takeout, and always pizza or lo mein out of one of those old school takeout boxes, never anything else. Yet I am never gaining a single pound. Although I do constantly talk about how heavy I am at a smooth size too. My mortal enemies are puddles and curbs and anything I could possibly trip on, but luckily I do usually find myself in the arms of my one true love when I do. I also have a non-white best friend who's there to offer me moral support occasionally in the form of witty comebacks and then disappear into the ether, never to be heard from again. I make entry-level wages, yet live in a glamorous, sprawling New York City apartment. But it's okay because money isn't important to me because I'm chill. But that being said, the man I fall in love with will obviously be wealthy, and that will be part of his appeal. And speaking of men, I think it's adorable when they withhold information or follow my every move or show up unexpectedly at the most inopportune times. That's not stalking, honey, that's called courting someone. But I wanted to make this video because I think that millennial women are in many ways in their rom-com era. They've basically never left it, and I include myself in that. Because millennial women came of age in a very unique era, both in terms of the pop culture that we were raised on and also in terms of the economy that we were unceremoniously thrust into. Now, we'll talk in this video about the golden age of the rom-com, but in general, most people would agree that the apex of the genre was somewhere between the early 90s and the late aughts, meaning that millennial women were at their most impressionable ages when they saw these movies, and by extension, learned these, at minimum we can say, pretty compromised lessons. We weren't adults going to see them with the critical distance of knowing that it's obviously a bit of a fairy tale, nor were we too young to not have absorbed them at all. We were at the peak ages where pop culture can mold and influence your understanding of the world around you and your expectations for yourself. A lot of the movies that I'm going to talk about in this video are ones that I remember watching as a preteen or teenager. And suffice it to say, at those ages, they hit different. They became core memories in some cases, and it took me years not just to unlearn what these movies taught me, but to even realize that they had infected my worldview at all. Now, some of the movies I'm going to talk about in this video are more on the chick flick side than the rom-com side. Things like Legally Blonde, The Devil Wears Prada, The Princess Diaries, etc. But we're going to consider them rom-coms in this case because they are primarily aimed at that same straight female audience and they have prominent romantic plot lines. But let's get into it, and frankly, what would a video about rom-coms be without a montage?
Why is it there are so many unmarried women in their 30s these days, Bridget?
Hey, pretty girl.
I look quite pretty.
No man can be friends with a woman that he finds attractive.
There are one or two things you need for a successful wedding.
You want to know a secret?
Yeah.
You're the sweetest guy I've ever known.
Are you comfortable?
Sure.
I like you, just as you are.
The first time that you saw me, I was...
You are mesmerizing. I'm also just a girl standing in front of a boy, asking him to love her.
You had me at hello. You had me at hello.
The downfall of the mainstream rom-com and everything else that isn't superhero movies.
As a casual consumer of pop culture, you might be thinking to yourself, well, yeah, we know that a lot of these movies pushed pretty toxic and outdated narratives, but it seems like they've totally disappeared, right? The answer to that question is kind of. So it's worth noting that the rom-com is, to some extent, having a bit of a renaissance. There have been several large movie releases, many on streaming, and the success of series like Bridgerton has been a hugely successful crossover in the always pretty steady romance genre of fiction to a water-cooler television show. And it's also worth noting that this renaissance of the rom-com has a much better and more diverse range of stories and voices, but we'll get into that in a bit. But it's important to note that rom-coms have nowhere near the chokehold that they once did on media and pop culture. As one article put it in the Dartmouth, in the early 2010s, rom-coms were never going to make $1 billion worldwide, and critically, they were never going to get the awards applause that studios are hungry for. So there was a sense that they weren't serving the purpose that the studios needed them to. But that being said, the rom-com wasn't necessarily a victim of the fact that it as a genre wasn't successful or resonating with audiences, because we can see that both of those things weren't true. It's more just a collateral victim of the overall decline of the mid-budget studio movie, and on a somewhat parallel level, monolithic pop culture. For this episode, we sat down with YouTuber extraordinaire, media expert, rom-com apologist, and friend of TFD Princess Weeks to talk about some of this stuff.
I think in the downfall of the rom-com era, you did see like the same kind of people playing the same kind of role. I think ultimately the rise of spectacle being the reason why people go to the movies, is what ruined the rom-com. But I also think that when we have seen non-white straight rom-coms come into the public venue, audiences have wanted to turn out for it, or at least support it. I think the big one everyone will go to is like Crazy Rich Asians. That was such a thing. I remember everyone wanted to go see it, everyone wanted to experience it, because it felt so like, we don't get this every year. I remember people who wanted to see, like when they were doing the first queer rom-coms, the Kristen Stewart one, even though I know it was like very split on how many people liked it. I think it's Happiest Season, but people still wanted to show up and see it. To All the Boys I've Ever Loved, I think Netflix has really changed the scope. I think that the tropes and cliches have a place in the genre, like any tropes and cliches. But I think as you expand it and you allow fresher, younger, queerer audiences to see themselves in it, you automatically have to challenge certain things. And I think now we have a better understanding of like how to deal with miscommunication tropes and these kind of things in a more productive way than the same sort of like everything falls apart and then at the very end it's like we're in love again.
According to data from Statista, rom-com box office numbers began declining significantly after 2011. YouTuber Nathan Zed pinpointed 2011 as the breaking point of the rom-com, as this was the year where two rom-coms with nearly identical plot lines were released: No Strings Attached and Friends with Benefits, or as they famously titled it in France, Sex Friends. That's true. That's actually true. Let's put the poster up. Okay. Perhaps the market at this point was just so oversaturated with rom-coms with repetitive tropes and plot lines that audiences were becoming fatigued. But as I mentioned, the bigger culprit is the overall disappearance of the medium-budget studio movie. Now, there's a lot of blame to be passed around, and trust me that the entertainment industry as a whole is doing its best to point that blame. But, and I risk poking one of the scariest bears on the internet here, some of that blame can be put at the feet of things like the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So from a Reuters article about the rise and fall of the rom-com, quote, "So we're in an era where audiences have kind of been sold that the theatrical needs spectacle to it," said Scott Meslau, author of From Hollywood with Love, The Rise and Fall and Rise Again of the romantic comedy. The decline in rom-com hits can be explained by the disinvestment in the genre from the big movie studios, according to Meslau. Part of the reason the death of the rom-com narrative was a misnomer was because it coincided with the death of the mid-budget Hollywood film. Studios got out of that mid-range. And blaming the Marvel Cinematic Universe isn't even a joke. Iron Man came out in 2008, toward the very end of the golden age of the rom-com, and coincidentally the first of those enormously big-budget films that have totally rewritten the superhero genre. As studios put more and more into movies that are more like must-see cinematic experiences, they have less to devote to mid-budget feel-good movies like rom-coms. But on that note, here's a little bit more from Princess Weeks.
Yeah, I think that they feel audiences want a big spectacle. The movies are just so expensive. It's like, how do you sell a meet cute in the same way, especially since rom-coms have been doing so well on streaming services. I think a lot of people turn up for them on the small screen. I think the only way you get like a big budget rom-com is if you either have like veteran actors, like I think the Julia Roberts, George Clooney film Ticket to Paradise, I think that did fairly well, but that's also going to bring in like the boomer audience and Gen X audiences that really like those things. And I don't think if you put Timothée Chalamet and Florence Pugh and say like it's a rom-com, it's going to get the same appeal as like older actors doing the exact same thing. I think that audiences need to know that it's going to be something different, and even if it's not going to be like a big movie, that it's going to be something special. And I think that specialness, directors are just not going to invest in the rom-com the way they used to, which is disappointing. On the indie scene, it definitely still happens. I think like even though it's not a full rom-com, I think Past Lives' success as like a smaller film about like love and romance was successful for that very reason.
And of course, with the rise of streaming and the overabundance of options and the decline in theater attendance since the pandemic, it's created an environment where only those mega blockbusters are really seen as viable hits, which is particularly sad when you consider just how much the mid-budget studio movie used to be part of our dominant pop culture. It wasn't just superhero movies or nothing. And from the perspective of rom-coms, there was a clear peak in 2002 when 3 separate rom-coms made it into the top 20 films of the year, including My Big Fat Greek Wedding, which is still the highest grossing romantic comedy of all time, and one of my personal favorites. And as I mentioned, we've also seen a dissolution of the entire concept of monolithic pop culture. Outside of, again, those really big budget cinema experiences like superhero movies, there are just very few things anymore that everyone is watching. These rom-coms used to be something that almost everyone you knew went to go see. And it's true that there are enormous upsides to having a much more diverse selection of pop culture, and each being able to kind of curate our own media experiences. But it does mean that for those of us who came of age during this heyday, there was pretty much only one prism through which we were experiencing romance in pop culture.
Millennial women and the rom-com, an economically chaotic match.
So as I mentioned earlier, despite the broader economic context, for millennial women specifically, who were raised on these rom-coms and these messages and then spat out into a world that looked nothing like it, our trajectory was particularly messed up by the 2008 recession following the subprime mortgage crash. Now, I famously did not graduate from college, but if I had, I would have graduated in 2011, which puts me smack in the middle of some of the worst after effects of said recession. Now, we certainly can't say that the 2008 recession killed the rom-com as we knew it. As we've already discussed, there were plenty of factors, but it is striking how much the decline of the rom-com's dominance in pop culture coincided with the economy flailing. Simply put, the premise of most mainstream rom-coms has always been that you're following a young woman who has pretty much everything figured out professionally, financially, personally. She has a great job, she makes more than enough money to float her lifestyle, she goes out every week, if not every other day, with her glamorous group of friends, she has a great wardrobe, she eats at nice restaurants. The only thing missing from her life is finding the right guy, which she can never seem to do until our hero comes along. For millennials in particular, 2 things coincided at the same time in the 2010s. The aftershocks of the recession, which devastated the job market, collapsed our homeownership prospects, depressed our wages even further, and generally made life much harder economically, and the rise and now total ubiquity of dating app culture. The average young adult woman now has basically the total reverse of the rom-com heroine. Her possible next date is literally a swipe away at any given time. There is an endless stream of dating opportunity, so much so that it causes plenty of other problems. And we're not even going to talk about the quality of the dating apps, just the fact that you can literally always hop on one if you want to. But everything else, the financial security, the professional growth, the solid group of friends who are all in similar socioeconomic brackets and can constantly afford to go out and do glamorous things together, that's everything that we don't have. And the rom-com's heyday was in the 1990s, which was certainly not perfect economically, but definitely aligned much more with the overall rom-com narrative. From a Wikipedia article literally titled 1990s United States Boom, the 90s are remembered as a time of strong economic growth, steady job creation, low inflation, rising productivity, economic boom, and a surging stock market that resulted from a combination of rapid technological changes and sound monetary policy. Simply put, in the rom-com's heyday, they
were much more aligned with the lives of the average woman watching it. And now, years later, although we are seeing occasional resurgences of the rom-com genre, there is definitely a lowered appetite for this kind of movie that, on the one hand, portrays itself as relatable. We're supposed to be able to project ourselves onto these heroines and relate to her struggles, but also so ludicrously aspirational in a context where even just having a job is far from a given. But I say there was only really one prism through which we were experiencing romance, and that's actually not totally true. Because one really interesting thing about rom-coms, and by interesting, I mean bad, and one of the many ways that it messed with millennial women's perception, is just how segregated it always was as a genre.
Romance is for white people.
We did a montage at the beginning of this essay of some really iconic rom-coms. You might notice, among other things, that it was extremely white. Here's another montage of the entire parallel universe of rom-coms that existed during the heyday but were not catered to white audiences.
All work and no play.
Do you want to be rich?
Made Stella a big success.
All's fair in love and basketball, baby.
Diane, when you get married, you give up the eyes for us, okay?
Why did I get married?
God did not intend for us to be with just one person.
I'll go on the date with you.
Yes!
We are really good at knowing how to love anything.
I've been in love with you from the first day I saw you.
Now, pop culture in general has always been white-centric. That is just undeniable. But it was particularly noticeable in rom-coms, especially about how it portrayed who got to fall in love and with whom. And obviously being super homogenous in any genre is bad, but when you're talking about something as foundational as teaching young women what they should expect out of their romantic lives, it's pretty damn insidious to have a genre that is almost literally entirely segregated. Because the dominant rom-com, especially during the Golden Age, taught us, without ever needing to explicitly say it, that love and marriage are fundamentally for white people. Historically, the dominant genre of the rom-com, which is to say the films that were making huge money at the box office and defining mainstream pop culture and our ideas about romance, have been overwhelmingly white, so much so that even the films that featured interracial couples still largely relied on at least one of the parties being white. There's an excellent article about this called "Why Does Hollywood Think Only White People Fall in Love?" which I highly recommend. But this isn't to say that rom-coms overall were always white. Black rom-coms in particular have been a cinematic staple that almost existed in parallel, with consistent production throughout the years, but rarely crossing over into, quote, mainstream, i.e. white audiences. There's actually a bit of a time capsule article from 2012 on this topic from the, of course, white male then executive editor of Salon.com that goes into the parallel universes of the mainstream rom-com and the non-white rom-com, which almost literally never crossed over. As I mentioned in the intro, one of the most cliched aspects of rom-coms is the non-white best friend who almost never gets any kind of story, let alone love story of her own. And occasionally one of the two love interests may be non-white in these rom-coms, but almost without fail, their partner must be. But the point is, although there has always been a very strong non-white rom-com landscape, the dominant narrative that most of us were being sold, even those of us who aren't ourselves white, is that love is for white people. But the extreme whiteness aside, we would simply not be the Financial Diet if we didn't dive into just how toxic so many of the messages around money and jobs and finance and self-worth and class and status were in these movies.
Gaslighting, gatekeeping, and girl bossing. The rom-com's relationship with money.
In fact, when I think about how, as millennial women, so many of our foundational ideas about love and relationships were poisoned, and I say this as someone who still loves a rom-com and watches them despite their often problematic nature, is that money has historically been a sort of unspoken background character in these stories. The way that money plays into these women's stories and relationships is never quite explicit, yet always drives home very specific ideas. That the man of your dreams should probably have a lot of money, that you yourself should not really care about it, but you should just constantly be flush with it, that your consumer habits and class signifiers should be wildly out of step with your actual income, and that a career is only important insofar as it doesn't disrupt your relationship.
Now, even before 2008, wages in the US have been stagnating since the early 1970s, according to CNBC. Between 1979 and 2020, workers' wages grew by 17.5%, while productivity grew over 3 times as fast at 61.8%. And this is obviously compounded by the skyrocketing cost of living, something that is basically infinitely worse in the major metro areas where these movies are taking place and these heroines live. For a little context, in order to live comfortably on a single person's salary in some of these areas, you would need the following, also according to CNBC. In San Francisco, you'd need to make $84,026 a year, in Boston, $78,752 a year, in New York, $78,524, Los Angeles, $76,710, and Washington, D.C., $76,194. Now, anyone with common sense can tell that this is wildly more than what the average young entry-level white-collar worker could expect to earn, because let's be clear that almost every heroine in these movies was an entry-level white-collar worker somewhere. But that's just to live comfortably, to have a normal apartment, to get normal groceries, to maybe go out every once in a while to the movies or dinner. We're not talking about the hyper-inflated consumer lifestyles that these heroines were living, in their huge apartments, with their designer wardrobes, going out every single night with their friends. That life has basically never been possible for young adult women. And as someone who went into pretty severe credit card debt and then collections, trying to spend her way into the lifestyle that she saw represented on movies and in TV and felt was what was expected of a young 20-something in order to be cool, to fit in, to find love, I can tell you that that difference between the economy that young women actually lived in and the ones we were seeing normalized for us had profound and devastating effects. And one other huge economic difference that anyone living the lives of these rom-com heroines would immediately feel is the total absence of student loans in these movies. Now, almost every rom-com heroine from the major movies we're going to talk about is either explicitly or implicitly college educated and working white-collar jobs that demand degrees. Unless you come from great wealth in this country, that probably for you means taking on some student loan debt. According to educationdata.org, 43.6 million borrowers have federal student loan debt. The average federal student loan balance is $37,718, while the total average balance, including private loan debt, may be as high as $40,499. We've talked before on this channel about the immense pressure that young people feel to go to school, to get as high a degree as someone will allow them to take out loans for, and to do so with the expectation that that is the only way to get a good job. Now, a lot of this obviously comes from our own families, from our peers, from guidance counselors, but media and pop culture have a huge impact. And when every heroine we were seeing on screen went to these prestigious schools, have these great degrees, and are now working these glamorous jobs in some skyscraper, it only compounds the pressure of needing to take out those loans. Only on our end, in reality, they don't actually lead you to the kind of jobs that fill your spacious closet with Manolo Blahniks. Now, I know we're talking about the rom-com, but Cosmo in hand, I must bring it back to our girl Carrie Bradshaw. And no, I am not watching the resurrected corpse of Sex and the City that is And Just Like That, and I never will, because I love myself. So we're talking about the OG series for a second. Carrie Bradshaw is often used, including on this channel, as a bit of an avatar for all of these incredibly toxic ideas about money and love. Carrie Bradshaw's relationship to money and her relationship to shopping and consumerism are probably amongst the bleakest ever portrayed on television, to be quite honest. There was an entire subplot about how Charlotte was a bad friend because she wasn't pawning her engagement ring to save Carrie from being kicked out of her apartment because she spent nearly $50,000 on high heels.
I spent $40,000 on shoes and I have no place to live?
And you might be thinking to yourself, well, that's a really interesting opportunity for a show that so thoroughly portrays women's lives and experiences to maybe talk about the consequences of shopping addiction and rampant consumerism. You would be incorrect. The moral of that story was that your friends should bail you out with the incredibly expensive jewelry they have knocking around in a desk. Anyway, point being, Carrie Bradshaw obviously typified that specific kind of narrative around love and money and ended the show with Mr. Big, a character whose two defining qualities were being completely emotionally unavailable and a multimillionaire. But she certainly didn't invent the genre. Sex and the City's relationship to money is kind of a distillation of all of the narratives about money and work and class that were already knocking around in the rom-com genre. Because there are examples from rom-coms that are even more egregious than Carrie's enormous rent-controlled one-bedroom. Sitcoms and rom-coms alike tend to exaggerate what the average person could realistically afford and explain it away with some loophole. Rent control, for instance, is an NYC policy that keeps rents of certain older apartment units consistent, but you can only be grandfathered in through families, so it's increasingly rare for a person to actually have. In You've Got Mail, struggling small business owner Kathleen Kelly lives in an incredibly beautiful brownstone apartment on West 89th Street. Perhaps this was more realistic in the 90s, but these days the average rent for a one-bedroom in that neighborhood is over $4,600 a month. And keep in mind that her place is sprawling by NYC standards. And Jenna, Jennifer Garner's character in 13 Going on 30, lives in a similarly aspirational NYC home. The movie shows her leaving her building at 51 Fifth Ave, right around Union Square, which was already a gentrified and extremely pricey neighborhood in the early aughts, and all of this was on a magazine editor's salary. There could be a whole other video about the lies that these movies specifically fed to people looking to go into the media and journalism industries, because every one of these was a magazine editor or a columnist or a writer, and the kind of money they were making, baby, they were making like tech startup money. And as someone who has worked in media for 12 years, I can assure you that that is not what the money's like in this industry.
To talk a little bit more about these hilariously inaccurate portrayals of the middle class and why so many female leads in these movies work in media, let's go back to Princess.
You know, it's like the architect of women's jobs, you know, like it's I think people are like, they have this idea that we're just creative people and we have so much free time because we're always just thinking and not actually doing stuff. Like, I don't think that most of the people who write these stories like understand the day in and day outs of like, what is it like to work in media? Like when I was working at my media job at the Mary Sue, I was like at a desk writing articles for 8 hours a day, and I barely made time for myself to eat a salad, let alone have an entire dalliance with like the paper boy or whoever would have been in an equivalent. So I think media is a job that sounds middle class, especially in the aughts. I think even now people will be like, oh yeah, you work in media, you must make like $60,000, and everyone's like laughing with their two roommates in a small, 3-bedroom in Williamsburg. So I think back then it would seem like a job that would offer a character money, mobility, in a way that the audience wouldn't question why they dress so well, why they happen to be out all the time, why it seems that they have free time.
But that could also tie in neatly to the fact that so many of the women who are depicted as having these jobs and living incredibly affluent lifestyles that would totally not be afforded by an editor's salary are ultimately in the end swept away by a man who can take care of them. But it is interesting how in these movies, even if struggle is spoken of, it somehow never seems to come at the cost of an extraordinarily consumerist lifestyle. And the narrative that those of us watching at a young, impressionable age picked up was that to be a woman ultimately means to look a certain way, to buy certain things, to live in a certain home, and to present a certain level of affluence.
He's not charming, he's just a prince.
And as I mentioned, one of the common themes in these movies is that even if the woman is on some level struggling financially, and even is addressed explicitly or manages to cut in on her lifestyle, which is already fairly rare in these movies, part of the male main character's appeal is usually that he can deus ex machina her life with his unlimited finances. Again, obviously, Mr. Big to Carrie Bradshaw is a perfect example of that phenomenon. But as friend of TFD and personal friend of mine, Ashley Seaford, so brilliantly pointed out years ago, the real appeal of a lot of these leading male characters is not that they're sexy or romantic or interesting, but that they're rich. As a Guardian article on the topic put it, here wealth porn starts to look like a mold culture grown on actual porn. The women are kinda average, kinda broke, sexually inexperienced, and this dude just needs you to accept him and take all of his money, said Ashley Seaford, who traced this as the through line between Twilight and 50 Shades. And even in movies that attempt to address this outright, like Confessions of a Shopaholic, which does actually go into the protagonist's debt problem, she still ends up with her rich boss. The narrative of so many of these movies is that ultimately, while love is very important, that it happens against a backdrop of total financial security, if not excess, is almost more important. And on some level, that's kind of their right to do, right? Like, if the message is just gonna be marry a rich dude, like, work, sis, I don't know what else to say. But it's especially toxic when you consider just what this marry a rich man narrative was paired with in a lot of these movies, which is a narrative of, your career doesn't really matter. Why worry your pretty little head over something like that? Now, there is a bit of a narrative arc throughout the golden age of rom-coms, and we do at some points tend to start to circle back to the girl boss of it all, which we will get into. But for many years, the dominant narrative of the rom-com was that work is at best an afterthought. And in many cases, the ultimate aspirational choice for a woman is portrayed as abandoning their career goals in favor of being with the male love interest, like in movies like Sweet Home Alabama, or How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days, or You've Got Mail. In You've Got Mail, Joe, played by Tom Hanks, literally brings about the downfall of Kathleen's, played by Meg Ryan, small business, and we're supposed to just accept it because she maybe hints at not wanting to do it forever. She's left putting her life back together and figuring out her next steps, while he continues in the same capitalist trajectory, running a Barnes & Noble-esque bookstore chain his family owns and bringing down independent bookstores as much as he can, with no hint of changing his ways. Now, I do love this movie, but I truly don't know why we're supposed to be rooting for them to get together. A testament to their chemistry, I guess. What happened to chemistry? What happened to movie stars?
Just so you guys know, I expand more on my thoughts on chemistry in these movies, as well as many more subtopics in this video, in the ad-free director's cut exclusive to members of the society at TFD. Be sure to join at the $4.99 tier, either here on YouTube or on our Patreon, to get access. It's much longer than this video. It's totally ad-free. It's a slay.
And You've Got Mail is just one example of a woman abandoning her career, or at least majorly stepping back in order to be with the man that she loves. Sweet Home Alabama and How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days both end on that same note. The note of, who cares about a career, honey, you got a man now. And we would be remiss in the conversation about the male savior without talking about perhaps the most iconic in the genre, Pretty Woman. Now, this movie came out towards the beginning of the golden age of the rom-com, so it didn't quite hit millennial women at exactly the same tender age. But in this seminal film, he literally rescues her via her fire escape at the end of the movie to bring her into a life of comfort and affluence. And on top of the narrative about a man whisking you away into a life that you couldn't otherwise afford, so many of these movies are in a chokehold of obsessing over the idyllic suburban American life. In so many of these movies, there is a total romanticization of what a suburban life should mean for a woman. In 13 Going on 30, for instance, the more fulfilling path that Jenna chooses lands her in an aspirational, sprawling suburban home with a husband and implies that there's a family on the way. Her ultimate choice was between that suburban dream life and the life of a cold career city girl, implying that the city career girl path is not the fulfilling one. It's almost a joke at this point, the trope of the city girl leaving her life of corporate success and Chinese takeout dinners to move to the suburbs, or sometimes even a rural farm or small town, to marry a man who will relieve her of the burden of ever having to be in charge of her own life.
Your job, the one true love of capitalism.
But as I mentioned, there was a bit of a narrative shift amongst some of these rom-com tropes that really dovetailed and echoed some of the sociological and economic and political changes that we were seeing from roughly the early 90s to roughly the late aughts. And that is the arc toward the girl bossification of the rom-com and the chick flick. So Legally Blonde, for instance, shows a woman whose initial motivation is to enter into a career, law, to impress a man, but who ultimately chooses to continue it because she fell in love with the career itself. Now, did she find another man along the way? Yes, because this is still a movie catered toward young straight women. So it certainly wouldn't dare imply that a person can be fulfilled without a romantic partner. But it's also not exactly given tons of screen time, and her career is ultimately shown to be the true love of her life. And Ella's portrayed as an empowered woman for choosing herself over a man, and that is certainly true, but choosing herself ultimately means choosing a career in which she is intensely overworked. And perhaps the most egregious example of this trope is The Devil Wears Prada. Now, I recently rewatched it for this video, and while I still love the hell out of that movie and it remains a classic in my opinion, and honestly that wardrobe looks just as good today as it did in 2006, shout out Pat Field, it is undeniable just how like Yas Queen girl boss second wave feminism pilled that movie is. Like, not only is Andy shown as like objectively being in an openly abusive and hostile workplace, for the most part, she's actually portrayed in that movie as being like the one who doesn't get it. Like that whole monologue from Meryl Streep about how like the blue that she's wearing was actually chosen for her by these people, and like it's supposed to be kind of a mic drop moment for that character, when looking back it's like obviously arbitrary and Andy was totally right to laugh at how similar those two belts were. And although yes, she does technically quit at the end of the movie, because of course Miranda Priestley was portrayed as her ball-busting career coming at the cost of her second marriage, ostensibly her enemy to friend Emily is still very much in the job and part of this overall industry, as are all of the other friends she made along the way. And Miranda Priestley winning and getting to keep her job despite being an objectively abusive and terrorizing boss was also seen as a win within the narrative of the film. And Andy was shown going to another journalism job where it's not only implied that she'll also be working crazy hours there for a somewhat gruff boss. The fact that she submitted to a year plus of being abused by her boss was reason for her to get a recommendation for the job.
So it would be impossible to talk about the girl bossification of the rom-com, and how we went from this paradigm of a woman's highest calling is to leave her job behind in pursuit of the perfect man, to her soulmate is sometimes actually her job, without talking about Crazy Rich Asians. Now, I personally love the movie Crazy Rich Asians, problematic as it may be in some ways, and it's important to give it its due credit for both helping to resuscitate the rom-com genre with its unprecedented box office success in 2018, and its pretty revolutionary nature of being an almost exclusively non-white cast in such a previously homogenous genre to reach such high levels of mainstream success. But as previous TFD guest and one of my favorite YouTubers pointed out in his excellent video on the movie Crazy Rich Asians, it did take some pretty interesting liberties as opposed to the popular book it is based on when it comes to the representation of wealth, class, and women's empowerment. Now, there are many changes across the movie, but one of the most notable that sends a very distinctly girl bossy message is the character of Astrid. So spoilers ahead if you haven't seen the movie and want to, but basically there is a very key change from the book. In the book, Astrid's husband is suspected of cheating on her, only to find out that he was essentially staging an affair to drive the two of them apart because he was so emasculated by her family's wealth. In the movie, it turns out that he actually is cheating on her. He's envious of her for much more dubious reasons, and her girl boss story arc ends with her buying 7 figures worth of jewelry. Similarly, some of the questions about wealth and class that separate and complicate our main couple in Crazy Rich Asians in the book are flattened to be more about cultural differences. Essentially, the movie Crazy Rich Asians takes the teeth out of some of the class and wealth commentary that's pretty interestingly represented in the book. The accumulation of wealth, especially for women in the movie, is represented as basically an unquestioned good. And again, I must shout out Big Joel's video, who goes into this in a very deep dive and does an excellent job. But at the height of the 2010s girl bossery, it is interesting to see just how much a movie literally titled Crazy Rich Asians was afraid of actually talking about some of the implications of being so crazy rich.
Wined, dined, and lightly stalked.
Now, obviously, whether the narrative is let's get a man to come in and save the day or being horribly overworked is actually feminist, all of these narratives have a pretty tenuous relationship with actual reality and what would be positive for not just women, but workers more generally. But even outside of the purely financial or professional, these movies were also notorious for normalizing terrible behavior, often in the name of romance itself. One of the most sinister things that the rom-com did for millennial women was to help normalize bad behavior from men, from light boundary pushing to aggressively pursuing to downright stalking. Pop Culture Detective has an excellent video called Stalking for Love that breaks down the trope of stalking in particular in rom-coms as well as in romantic plotlines in other genres. But it's not just stalking. There are many rom-coms that are basically entirely centered around deception, where essentially one of the protagonists, if not both, are intentionally deceiving the other one. In 27 Dresses, James Marsden, perpetual loser of many a rom-com, purposefully keeps Katherine Heigl's lost date book to find out more about her and to follow her around. And he continues showing up unannounced places, and the main premise of the movie is him writing an article about her, including photos without her knowledge or consent. In She's All That, Zach, Freddie Prinze Jr., starts to pursue Lainey, Rachel Lee Cook, because of a bet that he secretly has to make her over into a prom queen. Lainey even calls out Zach on his stalker behavior at the beginning, aka lampshading or calling out a trope within the context of a movie, very meta. But this of course does not prevent her from falling in love with him anyway. And 10 Things I Hate About You has a similar premise, where Patrick, Heath Ledger, is paid to take out Kat, Julia Stiles, so that her younger sister is allowed to start dating. How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days, one of my least favorite rom-coms I've ever seen. I watched it recently, and maybe I just needed to see it when I was a teenager so that it would really hit, but what the hell was happening in that movie? somebody needs to explain to me how Matthew McConaughey's character was supposed to be from Long Island when him and everyone in his family had thick Texas accents. What was happening? Why couldn't he have just been from Texas? Anyway, How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days is one of the rare rom-coms where they are mutually deceiving each other based on a bet with friends and a secret article being written. Why are these movies so addicted to making people have implausible magazine jobs? It's baffling. But these movies all normalize, if not romanticize, the idea that it's totally acceptable to violate boundaries and to stalk and to deceive, and that frankly, if you're attractive and charismatic enough, that's actually kind of cute. To talk about the normalization of stalking in these movies, love that for us, let's go back to Princess.
I think it's more just the tropes were just getting meaner as well. You know, I think it gives a lot of dubious stuff about boundaries. I do think that that's a big thing that happens, especially because you see a lot more workplace relationships than I think that we would accept now. You see a lot more light stalking as like an appropriate way of like meeting someone. So I think it has huge boundary issues. You know, everyone will bring up the Notebook where he kind of like follows her to the park and like goes on the Ferris wheel to be like, date me or I'm gonna like jump off the thing. Lol. It's like, okay, Ken. Or just any time when like a girl is saying like, what are you doing here? And he's like, I was just walking around. Like that kind of whole thing of like, if they're in the same area, he's always kind of be around. Or even stuff like, I think like the Kissing Booth has this weird thing of like, they're like the main guy is like very like, who are these boys who are around you? It's like, can we just breathe? Can we calm down? Especially in the 80s, I would watch these films where it was like whoever the love interest was, there was an idea that he was allowed to be a little bit creepy because they were going to end up together, so it was all going to be kind of like fair game. Or like anytime that a guy is like looking at a woman through a window and seeing her undress, you know, I think of like that it's like but like he'll look away and then turn back and then she'll be like either smiling at him or like she'll be fully dressed all of a sudden. It's supposed to be like, oh, he's just a little awkward, you know. It's like, no, you shouldn't, like, first of all, you shouldn't spy on your neighbors, but also you shouldn't spy on your neighbors watching them get undressed. Like, it's not a cute, quirky personality trait, you know. Because even with, I think, you know, the big one that's been recently, like Twilight and 50 Shades, because they're all engaged in some kind of like light stalking, and with both of them it's kind of played for like, he's so protective. And it's like, I would respect it more if they just said it was creepy, you know, like there's dark romance exists for a reason. Like if they said it was creepy and just leaned into that, I could respect it, but they don't. So therefore I rage.
Of course, it's worth noting that part of what makes the bad behavior in these movies so implicitly permissible is that the people doing them are hot.
I like watching you sleep.
In fact, the rom-com gives us a sort of reality where hotness is amongst your most important traits and both justifies and contextualizes nearly everything you do. But especially for women in rom-coms, it's very important that no matter how hot they are, they never know that they're hot. And often none of the people around them acknowledge it either. Which brings us to our next subject. You should be hot, but you should never know you're hot.
Now, perhaps one of the more pervasive norms in not just rom-coms, but in the culture that they created, was the idea of the pick-me girl. Now, the not like other girls trope was ubiquitous in not just some of these movies themselves, but even in movies that attempted to subvert the trope. Like, I'm sorry, 500 Days of Summer, I know that we were calling out the fact that Zooey Deschanel's character was a classic not like other girls, but it still basically followed the exact same narrative beats. And for example, her character was still the thin, conventionally beautiful white woman that gets to play these type of roles. And one of the things that really defined a pick-me or not like other girls, aside from the fact that she's chill, she's cool, she's down to do whatever the guy wants to do. She loves sports. She doesn't make a big deal out of things. And I could go on, but you could also just go back and watch the cool girl monologue from Gone Girl, because they really did that. And also, Ben Affleck is hot as hell in that movie. Honestly, talk about chemistry. I kind of was rooting for them. A couple murders here and there. What's that between two people who really love each other? Anyway, as so aptly put in the cool girl monologue, the not like other girl, rampant in the rom-com genre, has an incredibly casual relationship to almost everything, as we were all taught to aspire to as women. But perhaps none of their relationships was more casual or more baffling than their relationship to food and their bodies. Because if there were two things that Golden Age rom-coms were addicted to doing, it was talking about how horrendously large, objectively thin women are, and making a joke out of borderline disturbing alcohol consumption. Because the rom-com women women generally fell into one of two categories as it pertained to food and drinking and bodies. Either they were constantly throwing back beer and buffalo wings, yet always being incredibly slender and never having any kinds of repercussions from it, or they were portrayed as committing the unforgivable sin of actually gaining weight from all the food that they eat, in which case that became a central focus of their character. Now, obviously that was an entire arc in The Devil Wears Prada that, again, as far as I know, we never resolved. She slimmed herself down to a size 4, and that was always portrayed as a positive thing. But perhaps no movie is as perfect an example of what happens to a rom-com protagonist when they don't fit the cool girl narrative as Bridget Jones's Diary, which is heavily centered around talking about how fat and unattractive Renee Zellweger's character is, despite objectively being neither of those things. It produced, amongst many others, this particularly eye-searing piece of dialogue. December 25th, weight 140 pounds plus 42 mince pies, alcohol units, thousands. Now, obviously, Bridget Jones committed the cardinal cool girl sin of actually showing a change in her body, whereas the huge value placed on thinness was often so powerful because it never went spoken, and it was normal to show these protagonists constantly consuming chaotic amounts of food, like on Gilmore Girls, or drinking tons of alcohol, something that objectively would, among many other effects, cause someone to gain weight, and yet it never becomes an issue, because the girl is cool. As you can see here in so many rom-coms, drinking and eating are a huge part of what it means to be a modern, empowered, cool woman. And even protagonists who do slip from coolness to insecurity are redeemed by having a man tell her that she's beautiful, whether it's when she takes off her glasses, or falls in love, or has the wherewithal to slim down from a size 6 to a size 4. In fact, the earlier mentioned My Big Fat Greek Wedding might be one of the rare good examples of a makeover in a movie, because it happens when Tula decides that she is worthy of self-love and investing in herself, rather than when a man decides it for her. As girls consuming these movies, forming our very early ideas about our bodies and how they look and how we feel in them and what we're putting into them, the double-edged sword of rom-coms, either making the constant consumption of food and alcohol with no visible effects on the body be such an admirable trait in a protagonist, or watching a woman channel relatability via constantly struggling with said body image despite being an objectively conventionally attractive woman, left us with no good options. We were expected to have a pizza with the guys, but also expected to punish ourselves endlessly if that pizza dared be visible on our body. And listen, while this happens to be a stunt cosmopolitan, it's actually just fruit punch soda, as I mentioned, I do enjoy an actual martini. So I would be hypocritical to say that alcohol can't be a part of a woman's life. But the extent to which it was a part of women's lives in these rom-coms is like something worth considering. Not to go back to Sex and the City, but the way that these 30-something women were ostensibly just chugging multiple martinis on weeknights before getting up for high-powered jobs the next day, like rarely has there been a more unrelatable trope on a television show. The consumption of alcohol in so many of these romances and sitcoms and rom-coms is nothing short of worrisome. It's not just about, hey, I'm going out with some friends and might have a few drinks and enjoy myself. It's I'm constantly pictured with a glass of wine or a beer with the guys. It's an emotional crutch and also an aspirational symbol. The marketing of alcohol to women in particular is deeply insidious, and not just because women are more sensitive to the effects of alcohol at smaller doses, but because it's marketed to us as a luxury consumer good. The heavy association that these rom-coms created between an aspirational adult woman and the constant consuming of alcohol is something that is absolutely worth another look.
Congratulations, life ends at 30.
Now, this is a problem in Hollywood in general, but it is worth noting that in movies like Love Actually, where Keira Knightley was 17 years old at the time of filming, the imperative that women be youthfully attractive in these movies is so intense that in some cases it's acceptable that they're literal teenagers. In fact, just in Love Actually alone, you can see several hetero pairings where the man is substantially older than the woman he's playing against. But I'll almost give rom-coms a pass for this flaw, as it's so heavily ingrained in Hollywood in general that it almost just seems like a fundamental aspect of making movies or television at this point that the man has to be substantially older.
And perhaps one of the most insidious things about the constant age disparity between men and women in these movies in particular is that aside from just reinforcing the norm that women should always look young and beautiful, and that's essentially what we owe society, while men get to age and move on with their lives, in rom-coms in particular, where the goal is usually to end up married or at least in a long-term relationship, There's a very subtle implication that if you don't get married by roughly 30 years old, that you're a failure.
Everything about what we're shown about romance and love gives us high expectations. I think that, if anything, I think it kind of rushes you to feel like if you haven't found love in your 20s, that you're kind of doomed, and that like your 30s are a dreadful time if you haven't gotten married. I think the unrealistic expectations and things like that are sort of like on an not individualist manner, but I think that there are going to always be audiences that watch this stuff and just want to eat the candy corn and don't think about it at all. And then there are going to be people who do internalize it. And then there are going to be people who like know that it's candy corn, but still enjoy it anyway. I think that the female audience, the audience that watches rom-coms is always going to be half people that completely buy into it, like that love the corporatization of love. And then there are other people who want to see a love story and just want to turn off their brain for a few minutes, and hopefully it's a good time. But if it's problematic, they'll be aware of it and call it out.
Now, I talked a little bit about this on a recent TikTok of mine. The perception that women's lives end after 30 does us many disservices, but one of them notably is keeping untold numbers of women stuck in mediocre to bad marriages because they're convinced that after that age, simply no one will want them, which is categorically untrue. But it's also worth noting that for most people, the time that we even get married in the first place is becoming later and later in life. In 2021, the national median average of first marriage was about 29.2 years old, 30.2 for men and 28.1 for women, which is a 32% increase in the last 48 years. And if you're wondering, the urban metropolises where these rom-com heroines are living typically have even later ages of first marriage. In Washington, D.C., for example, the age of first marriage averages at 31.95 years. Now, this is not to say that any age is the right or wrong age to get married. It's only to acknowledge that this constant unconscious framing of women's lives beginning and ending in their 20s and securing their happily ever after well before they hit 30 isn't just very damaging to our notion of what should be expected of us romantically, it's also categorically untrue. And that pressure to marry before a certain age, subtle and insidious as it might be, undoubtedly lands many women and men in the wrong relationships, and certainly the wrong marriages, in an effort to sort of beat the clock. But as I said, it's not just rom-coms that feature the older man, younger woman trope. That's basically just a feature of essentially every piece of media that we consume at this point. It just so happens that rom-coms are also teaching us such explicit lessons about what we should expect from marriage.
Ultimately, the rom-com is many things, but one thing it is above perhaps all else is a foundational text of how women of a certain age grew up to see themselves and to see love itself. I still love a rom-com, still love many of these same movies that we've talked about, and can enjoy them while still holding in my head their problematic aspects. But ultimately, as millennial women, it is our duty to ourselves to remember the very tender age we were when these movies dominated our cultural narratives, and unlearn some of the many problematic tropes that they taught us, financial and otherwise. Cheers, girls. Bye.